Lunchtime at a crowded mall food court in downtown Chicago. The air is a chaotic mix of shouting vendors and clattering trays. Daniel Brooks, a 41-year-old single father, is eating with his 9-year-old daughter, Emma. Every table is full. Suddenly, a young woman approaches. She's leaning on crutches, one leg replaced by a high-tech prosthetic. People glance, then quickly look away. Their faces a mask of uncomfortable pity. She stops at Daniel's table. Her voice is a soft whisper. "Excuse me, may I share your table?" Daniel looks at her for 5 seconds, then says something that stops the room. "Watch." Now, the woman's name was Lena Carter. At 26, she was a vision of survival, though the world usually only saw the missing limb. 3 years ago, a rainy night and a reckless driver had changed the trajectory of her life in a single metal-crunching heartbeat. Since that day, Lena had become an expert in the gaze. It was that specific, heavy look people gave her, a mixture of "thank God it's not me" and a shallow, performative sadness. Lena was an architect by trade, a woman who spent her days designing structures meant to withstand the elements. But she found that the most difficult structures to navigate weren't made of steel and concrete. They were made of human judgment. Every time she stepped out of her apartment, she felt the invisible glass wall rise. People were either too helpful, treating her like she was made of fine china and might shatter at a single touch, or too distant, afraid that making eye contact would somehow make them responsible for her tragedy. She had spent months in physical therapy, learning to balance on one leg while her mind tried to balance the loss of her former self. The hardest part wasn't the physical pain. It was the fact that she had stopped being Lena the professional and had become the girl with one leg. In her firm, she noticed the senior partners spoke to her slower than they used to. In the grocery store, she saw parents pull their children away as if her disability were contagious. She was tired of being a lesson in bravery for strangers who didn't even know her middle name. Daniel Brooks watched her from his seat at the small, wobbly table. He didn't see a tragedy. He didn't see a heroic survivor to be analyzed. He saw a woman who was holding a heavy tray of lukewarm Chinese food and looking for a place to sit in a room that was running out of floor space. Daniel understood the frequency of that look better than anyone else in that mall. 5 years ago, he had watched his daughter Emma struggle with a severe speech impediment after his wife Sarah passed away. Emma's stutter was a physical manifestation of her grief. Daniel had seen the way other parents looked at his daughter when she struggled to order a simple ice cream cone, the forced smiles, the impatient nodding, the way they would eventually look at him with that poor father expression. He had spent years teaching Emma that her voice didn't need to be fast to be important. He had raised her to see the person, not the struggle. He taught her that the loudest thing about a person should be their integrity, not their circumstances. Lena stood there, her knuckles white on her crutches, her shoulders tensed against the expected rejection. She had already passed 3 tables where people had suddenly become very interested in their phones or their salads to avoid inviting her. She was braced for the usual lies. "Sorry, we're waiting for a friend," or the frantic, overly dramatic clearing of bags that felt more like a charitable contribution than a seat. When Daniel looked up at her, he didn't tilt his head in that sad puppy way that made Lena want to scream. He didn't rush to grab her tray as if she were a child who couldn't handle her own weight. He simply looked at her with the same neutral, observant gaze he used when checking a blueprint. He moved his jacket from the empty chair with a casual flick of his wrist. The air around them seemed to thicken. A group of businessmen at the next table stopped their loud discussion about quarterly projections to watch the interaction. They were waiting for the polite rejection or the awkward charity. They expected Daniel to offer an overly enthusiastic, "Oh, please sit down, you poor thing. Let me help you." Instead, Daniel gave a small, almost mischievous grin. He looked at the mountain of pasta on Emma's plate, then back at Lena, and spoke the words that left everyone in a state of stunned silence. "Only if you don't mind us talking too much. My daughter has a lot of opinions on pasta, and I'm currently losing the argument. I could use a neutral witness." Lena froze. Her breath hitched in the back of her throat. For the first time in 3 years, an adult had challenged her rather than coddling her. The joke was a bridge. It was a golden ticket back into a normal life. It wasn't an act of pity, it was an act of inclusion. The tension in her shoulders didn't just ease, it evaporated like mist in the sun. She let out a short, genuine laugh, a sound that hadn't echoed in her own ears for a very long time. "I think I can handle some opinions," Lena replied, her voice gaining a strength and a clarity it didn't have a moment ago. She sat down, and as the crutches clattered softly against the table, the food court began to breathe again. But the observers weren't looking away anymore. They were watching the start of something they didn't quite understand. The beauty of a normal conversation in an extraordinary situation. The first few minutes were filled with the small, rhythmic sounds of eating. Daniel didn't ask how she lost a leg. He didn't ask if she needed help opening her water bottle or cutting her noodles. He simply went back to his conversation with Emma as if the seating arrangement had been like this since they arrived. "As I was saying," Daniel said, pointing a fork at Emma's plate with mock seriousness, "you can't judge the quality of a restaurant by the amount of cheese they put on top. It's all about the sauce-to-noodle ratio. If the sauce is hiding, the kitchen is hiding." Emma rolled her eyes with the practiced, theatrical expertise of a 9-year-old who had heard this speech a dozen times. "Dad, more cheese is always the answer. Science proves it. Cheese makes the sad parts of the day go away." She turned to Lena, her eyes bright with a natural, unshielded curiosity. "Don't you think? You look like someone who knows about important things. More cheese makes everything better, right?" Lena smiled, her hazel eyes reflecting the warm mall lights for the first time. She felt a strange electric sense of relief. "Actually, I'm with your dad on this one. If the sauce is good, the cheese is just a distraction. It's like a building. If the architecture is solid, you don't need to cover it in gold paint." Emma gasped, clutching her heart dramatically and leaning back in her chair. "2 against 1? This is a conspiracy. I'm being bullied by the adults in public. Where's the manager?" The laughter that followed was light, easy, and entirely real. To the people at the neighboring table, this looked like a family reunion. They couldn't see the crutches leaning against the leg of the table or the prosthetic limb tucked neatly to the side. They only saw 3 people engaged in the ancient, sacred ritual of a shared meal and a spirited debate about dairy products. Daniel watched Emma. He was proud. She wasn't staring at the prosthetic. She wasn't whispering to him, "What happened to her leg?" in a loud, embarrassing voice. She was treating Lena like a person who had a valuable opinion on pasta and architecture. That was the foundation Daniel had worked so hard to build since Sarah died. He knew that the greatest gift you can give someone who is different is the dignity of being ignored for that difference. Lena felt a warmth spreading through her chest that had nothing to do with the hot food. For years, she had felt like an exhibit, something to be studied, admired for its bravery, or pitied for its loss. She was used to being the inspirational story at parties. But here, between a dad who talked too much and a girl who was convinced cheese was a primary food group, she was just a diner. She was just Lena. She felt the weight of the gaze lifting, and for the first time in a long time, she didn't feel the need to hide her prosthetic under the table. "So, do you live in the city?" Daniel asked, leaning back. He was providing a non-anxious presence. He wasn't prying for data. He was offering a thread of connection. "I do," Lena said. "I'm an architect. I work at a firm about 3 blocks from here. We're currently trying to redesign the old library on 4th Street. I usually eat at my desk because the crowds can be a lot to manage. People are usually very focused. Crowds are just groups of people who are mostly worried about their own reflections in the shop windows," Daniel noted. "Most of them are so busy checking their hair in the glass that they wouldn't notice a dragon walking past them. Unless the dragon was blocking the escalators." Lena laughed again, her whole face lighting up. "You have a very practical view of the world, Daniel." "Logistics and systems engineering," he replied with a wink. "I like things that work the way they were supposed to. And usually, people work best when you just let them be who they are. No filters, no drama, just the reality of the situation. Emma finished her last bite and leaned in, her voice dropping into a serious whisper. My dad says everyone is a puzzle. Some puzzles are just missing a piece. But that doesn't mean you can't see the whole picture. My mom was a puzzle too. She went to the stars 5 years ago. The mention of his wife was soft, a familiar, well-loved note in their shared song. Daniel didn't flinch. He didn't look at the floor. He let the silence hang for a moment, a respectful, comfortable silence that acknowledged the presence of ghosts without letting them ruin the meal. She sounds like she was very wise, Lena whispered, her eyes softening. She was the best of us, Daniel said. As they talked, the atmosphere of the food court seemed to shift around them. The businessmen at the next table had stopped their aggressive talking. A woman walking past with a heavy shopping bag paused, looked at the trio, and instead of the usual pained grimace of pity she might have given a disabled girl, she gave a small, supportive smile to Daniel. The ripple effect of their normalcy was reaching out. They were proving that a table for 3 was big enough to hold the whole world's humanity. If only people were willing to pull up a chair and listen to a story about cheese. The plates were pushed aside, but no one was in a rush to leave. The mall music hummed in the background, a soft, unremarkable pop song. But for Lena, this felt like the most important afternoon of her year. She looked at her crutches, then back at Daniel. She felt a sudden, rare urge to share. Not because she was seeking sympathy, but because for the first time, she felt like her story wouldn't be the only thing he remembered about her. It was 3 years ago, Lena began. Her voice was steady, clinical. The way someone talks about a movie they've seen too many times. I was walking home from my first big project site. I was so happy. I was looking at the photos on my phone. I didn't see the car jump the curb. It was over in 3 seconds. I woke up in the hospital 2 days later, and the world was just smaller. The air smelled like antiseptic and regret. Daniel didn't interrupt. He didn't offer a, I'm so sorry, or a, that's terrible. He didn't reach across the table to pat her hand in that patronizing way that adults often do to comfort the broken. He leaned forward, his chin in his hand, listening with the same surgical focus he used when Emma was explaining a complex science project. The recovery was the easy part, Lena continued, a bitter edge touching her words. The physical therapy, the learning to walk again, the fitting for the prosthetic, that was just work. You do the reps, you sweat, you get stronger, but the hardest part, the part they don't tell you about in the brochures, is the loneliness of being a survivor. Everyone wants to tell you how brave you are. They want to make you a poster child for resilience. But no one wants to just ask you if you've seen the latest movie or if you think the weather's going to turn. You become a symbol, not a person. You become a what happened instead of a who are you. Emma was watching Lena's hands, which were moving as she spoke. Does it hurt? The little girl asked. It was a direct, honest, 9-year-old question. It wasn't asked with pity. It was asked with a desire for knowledge. Lena looked at Emma. She didn't hide the truth behind a good girl mask. Sometimes, Emma, sometimes my brain forgets the leg is gone and it tries to wiggle toes that aren't there. It's a very strange feeling, like a ghost tickling you, or like a song that's stuck in your head, but you can't hear the music anymore. Emma nodded solemnly. I have ghosts too. Sometimes I try to tell my mom a joke, and then I remember she's not in the kitchen. It's like a ghost joke. It's funny, but it makes your chest feel tight. Daniel's heart tightened. He saw the two of them, the woman who lost a part of her body and the girl who lost a part of her soul, connecting on a level that most adults would spend a lifetime trying to reach. They were speaking a language of loss that didn't require a translator. You're really strong, Emma added, reaching out to touch Lena's sleeve. Lena smiled, a soft, pained, but beautiful expression that made her look like the architect she was meant to be. I didn't feel like that at first, Emma. For a long time, I felt like I was less than everyone else. I felt like a broken toy that someone had tried to glue back together with the wrong kind of glue. I hated the crutches. I hated the way I looked in the mirror. I thought my value had been cut off along with the bone. Most people don't feel strong when the storm is hitting, Daniel said. His voice was a low, grounding anchor that seemed to pull the conversation back to the present. Strength isn't about standing still in the wind. It's about being willing to get back up after the wind knocks you into the dirt. Most of the strongest people I know are the ones who spend half their time wondering if they can make it through the next 10 minutes. You're not strong because you survived the car, Lena. You're strong because you're sitting here in a crowded mall, eating pasta and talking to a stranger. That takes a lot more courage than people realize. Most people would have stayed in the dark. You chose the food court. Lena looked down at her plastic tray. A single tear escaped and fell onto the yellow plastic surface. She quickly wiped it away, her face flushing. I'm sorry, I'm not a crier. I'm an architect. We're supposed to be rigid. Crying is just an overflow of data, Lena, Daniel joked, his voice warm. It's a system reset, nothing to be sorry about. My daughter cried for 3 hours last week because we ran out of the good maple syrup. Compared to that, you're doing great. Your data management is excellent. Lena laughed through her tear. The atmosphere at the table was no longer just normal. It was safe. In the middle of a city of millions, in a place defined by consumption and noise, 3 people had created a sanctuary of absolute, unshielded truth. Daniel realized then that by opening his table, he hadn't just given a woman a place to sit, he had given her a place to be human. And in return, Lena had given Emma a living lesson in resilience that no book could ever teach. They were no longer just sharing a table. They were sharing the weight of being alive. The lunch crowd was beginning to thin out. The frantic rush of the noon hour was over, and the mall was settling into a quieter, mid-afternoon hum. The sun was hitting the skylight at a sharp angle, casting long shadows across the food court. Lena began to gather her things, her movements slow and deliberate as she prepared to transition back into the gaze of the world outside their little circle. She stopped for a moment, her hands resting on the handles of her crutches. She looked at Daniel, her expression curious, searching for something she couldn't quite name. I have to ask you something, Lena said. Her voice was clear now, no longer a whisper. I've been thinking about it since I sat down. I've been waiting for the other shoe to drop, so to speak. Daniel nodded, leaning back in his chair. Ask away. We're in the data sharing phase now. No secrets at the pasta table. Why didn't you look at my leg? Lena asked. Her eyes were locked onto his, searching for any hint of a lie. When I walked up, when I asked to sit, you didn't even glance down. Everyone else in this room has tracked the movement of my prosthetic since I walked through the doors. Even the kids in the play area stopped to watch. But you looked at my eyes. You looked at the heavy tray. You even looked at my earrings. But you never looked at the leg. Why? Are you just that polite? The silence at the table was sudden. But it wasn't awkward. It was the silence of a deep thought being processed by a mind that valued logic. Emma looked at her dad, waiting for the answer. She knew his logic face well. Daniel leaned back, his hazel eyes calm and steady. Because you didn't ask me to, he said simply. Lena blinked. She looked confused. I don't understand. People look because they can't help it. It's a natural reaction to something different. In my world, in engineering and in parenting, you learn to follow the signals that people are actually sending, Daniel explained. When you walked up to this table, your signal wasn't, look at my injury. Your signal was, I have a heavy tray and I need a place to sit. If I had looked at your leg, I would have been responding to the part of you that happened to you. I would have been reacting to your history. But by looking at your face, I was responding to the person who was talking to me. Your leg is just a piece of hardware, Lena. It's part of your movement, but it's not part of your conversation. I was interested in the witness, not the evidence. He paused, a faint, kind smile touching his lips. Besides, I've seen enough blueprints in my life to know that a foundation is more than just the materials used. You don't judge a bridge by the rivets, you judge it by the span, and you look like you've got a pretty incredible span. Why would I focus on one rivet when the whole structure is right there? Lena sat perfectly still. The answer was so direct, so devoid of fake sentimentality or polite avoidance, that it felt like a physical relief. It wasn't that Daniel was ignoring her disability. He was just giving it the correct amount of importance. 0. He was treating her with a level of respect that was so absolute it was almost invisible. "You're the first person to say that," Lena whispered. "Most people think that not looking is a sign of being polite, but really, they're just afraid to see the truth. They're trying to prove they aren't biased. You saw the truth and you just decided it wasn't the most interesting thing about me." "It's definitely not," Daniel winked. "I'm still much more interested in your architectural views on urban planning, or your stance on the cheese with sauce debate. Those are the real metrics of a person." Lena let out a long, shuddering breath. The walls she had built over 3 long years were finally starting to show deep, permanent cracks. She realized that the gaze of the world was only powerful if she let it be the only thing she saw. Daniel had just handed her the key to her own prison. Daniel and Emma watched Lena walk away. She moved with a rhythmic, confident stride that seemed to push the mall air aside. She didn't look like a woman in need of a miracle or a charity seat. She looked like a woman on a schedule. She kept her chin up, her eyes focused on the exit, ignoring the people who still turned to stare. One of the men from the neighboring table, the one who had been the loudest at the beginning of the hour, cleared his throat. He looked at Daniel, his face a mixture of embarrassment and a strange, new curiosity. That was decent of you," the man muttered, avoiding Daniel's direct gaze. "I mean, most of us were just, we didn't want to make it weird. We thought giving her space was the right thing." Daniel turned his head, his gaze cool, analytical, and entirely unimpressed. "You make it weird by trying to make it special. People don't need your special treatment or your careful distance. They just need a chair and a conversation. If you can't manage that, then you're the one with the handicap, sir. You're the one who can't see past the surface." The man went quiet, turning back to his cold coffee. He didn't have a comeback. Daniel had just diagnosed the entire room without raising his voice. "Dad?" Emma asked, pulling on his sleeve as they stood up to leave. "Yeah, pal? Do you think Lena is going to be okay?" She looked a little sad when she left, but she was walking fast. Daniel picked up their trash, his eyes following Lena until she disappeared into the crowd near the central fountain. "She's more than okay, Emma. She's real. And real people have sad moments, but they also have moments where they realize they aren't alone in the view. Today, I think she realized she's exactly where she belongs, right in the middle of the world." As they walked through the mall, Daniel felt a profound, quiet sense of peace. He hadn't set out to be a hero. He hadn't planned a life lesson for his daughter. He had simply followed the one rule that kept his own world spinning after Sarah left. Treat people as they are, not as the world has labeled them. The story of the single dad and the girl at the table didn't end with a headline or a dramatic vow in a rainstorm. It ended with a simple Tuesday afternoon. But in that mall, in that city of millions, the frequency had changed. A few more people were looking at the eyes instead of the hardware. A few more chairs were being pulled out for the people who really needed a place to rest. True respect, it isn't a speech, it isn't a donation. It's the quiet, simple decision to see the person sitting right in front of you. Daniel Brooks was home, and for the first time in a long time, the view was perfect. True connection begins the moment we stop looking for the broken parts of others and start seeing the whole person. Pity is a wall, but normalcy is a bridge. Never underestimate the power of a simple, honest conversation. It might be the only thing someone needs to remember who they truly are. Respect is not a favor we do for the unfortunate. It is the natural response to a fellow human being. If you believe that respect means treating everyone the same, subscribe for more stories like this. And tell me in the comments, would you have invited her to sit? Have you ever felt unseen in a crowd?